What can a Landsknecht account teach us about why Germans preferred Messers? Let's find out. Hey, sword dude and dudettes, we're back, and this time we're going to be looking at historical accounts from the 16th century. So I was online and I saw a post made by Liam Clark. This is from Evergreen Historical Fencing, and it talks about some accounts from a Landsknecht during the middle of the 16th century, and these were really, really cool. So we're going to link to Liam's posts so that everyone can go and take a look at this blog for themselves. But I wanted to read through a couple of these accounts and talk over some of the real-time accounts of historical use of swords and other things and see what they had to say for us. So these are from the record of Hans Wilhelm Kirchhoff. Everyone's going to forgive my German pronunciation, and they're from around 1560 is when they were originally published. And so these are taking place from the first account from the Second Margrave War between 1552 and 1554, between a bunch of German states and the bellicose Margrave Albrecht II. So the first account is talking about unruly soldiers in camp. Where have we ever heard this before? But it's pretty interesting, and I think it might inform us a little bit as to why Messer were so popular in German land. So listen to this. We hear from Hans himself. I remember something here about which one can laugh. In the year 1554, as soldiers had become bold and unruly because of the long idleness, also due to the unsoberness and well-provisioned camp, they engaged in a daily, never-ending gambling and tussling, which the word in German is Balgen. Although it had been announced to the sound of drums and prohibited, this did not cease. The colonel, Oberst, once more announced to the sound of drums that no one should take peace, that is, settle a conflict by themselves, under no circumstances. So they're in the middle of this protracted conflict, and they're not in the thick of it right now, so everyone is in a well-provisioned and unsobered camp. So they have lots of food, lots of drink, they have nothing to do but access still to presumably weapons, and they're getting into it with each other. So while they're drunk, someone calls someone else a pig, and they decide to go at it. And the colonel is very upset and says no one should take matters into their own hands, but apparently, even though this is the official position of the camp, that it's still occurring. Meanwhile, the soldiers ran towards each other and brought their weapons above each other's necks and heads, locked them together, and thus nastily cut up and mutilated necks, arms, and hands. This caused the colonel to change this path and prohibit the following. Even if they were to take peace, that is, settle conflicts, nobody should be bandaged. Okay, so a couple interesting things here are going on. They're coming at each other, and they have their weapons raised high, and they are getting whacked up. It says they're mutilating necks, arms, and hands. That tells us something right away about what the favored targets are. And again, it says that they're going at it perhaps caveman style, that they're raising their weapons high and going like this. They're not coming at each other in distress or something like that. And so everyone is getting super wounded. So the colonel can't stop this fighting. What does he do? He's like, all right, you guys have lost your first aid rights. No one's going to the barber. No one's going to the surgeon. No one's getting bandaged because you guys are causing all these wounds, probably running up a huge medical bill. Now, the first and the other prohibition did not make the drunks temper their wrath, but the third one was too severe, since the wounded soldiers died unbandaged. Uh-oh. They're still getting in fights, they're still getting wounded, and without proper medical attention, everyone's starting to die. Also, the field surgeons would not have been content with it for long. Therefore, one came up with a plan, and finally it was announced that nobody would be allowed to tussle in most places in the camp, with the exception of up by the fortifications. There, the provost would place a flag or a sign. So it's like, all right, you guys we're going to have a designated fighting area. Gonna go up and fight by the flag if you insist on fighting. But this was a raised and exposed place by and in front of the fortifications, directly opposite House Flossenburg, so right across from where they're under siege or where they're fighting. Only a small narrow valley was in between, so that one could easily see from one place to the other and yell that one could hear it. What should happen? When the first ones proceeded there and had barely exchanged one strike or two, the enemies, as if one had set them to it or informed them, fired a shot from the castle with a serpentine gun, and soon afterwards with a big artillery piece, which hit not far from the fighting cats, so that the dirt was thrown up around them. Interesting that he calls them fighting cats. Again, we have the name Katzbalger for the little sword. Maybe some etymology there as to why the sword is called a Katzbalger, if he's again using the allusion to these brawlers being called fighting cats. They soon sheathed and fled. The others refrained henceforth from this Fechtschule, so this sword fight, even though it had been allowed to them. And then he concludes with a poem. Previously, the drunk windbags feared no wound, iron, or jail, parenthetically, which was supposed to keep them quiet from tussling. Hither came the Margrave, and soon created peace, but in a new way and fashion. So, even though the colonel's efforts to get the men to stop fighting were stymied, eventually, once he came up with the official dueling ground, it was so close to the opposing fort that they came under artillery fire, and that was enough to keep everyone from fighting. So, really interesting. But we have a couple of really interesting anecdotes here. So, what is going on? The soldiers, when they're going after, it doesn't say what weapons they're using, but it does say that they are swinging with the weapons above their heads at each other rather than going kind of point forward after each other. They're not engaged in a lot of point forward, point centric work. And that is kind of consistent with what we think of when we think of either, fighting with fetters, or also why things like messers might have been popular. If you'll, anyone who listened into the talk with James Elmsley and myself may have heard his anecdote how someone was brought up on a type of a criminal offense, and one of the penalties he suffered was that he was allowed to keep a knife, but the tip of it had to be broken so that it couldn't be used for thrusting. And while you certainly can engage in thrusting with a messer, there's no doubt that this is a weapon that's specialized for delivering cuts. And so the men seem to when they're tussling with each other, they really seem to engage in chopping at one another, but not engaged in thrusting. And Liam makes a comment on this here. He's mentioning Joachim Meyer, who points out that soldiers fence and get into conflict with each other, stating honorable soldiers would forgo thrusts in the altercation. So from Meyer it says, for although the thrusts were permitted by our forefathers in earnest cases against common enemy, yet not only did they not permit it in sporting practice, but they would also in no way allow it in their sworn-in soldiers or others who had come into conflict with each other except against the common enemy, a custom that should still be observed today by honorable soldiers and by civilian Germans. So that's from 1570, so a little bit after this time period. So even though this is just prior to the heyday of when rapier fencing really takes off in Italy, and again, we don't know exactly what swords they have. It's possible that some of them were arming swords. It's possible that there were side swords, which certainly could deliver thrusts. It does seem that thrusts were not being used, even though some of the wounds were so grievous that some of these soldiers were still dying. But the targets they're talking about against the hand, the arms, the scalp, the neck, these are the type of things that you would expect to see when folks get into Fechtschulen, when folks are engaged in kind of bouts of swinging fencing, if you will, trying to deliver cuts or score points against one another. And even if you do it with a sharp blade, you'll certainly open each other up when doing it. So very interesting. Now, there's another account here. Again, he has several accounts, so please go and read Liam's original blog. But this one is rather interesting because it talks about Hans engaged in combat with multiple people and specifically against peasants. So this is one of those situations that we always see in a movie where you have multiple combatants. In a movie, the hero is able to use his superior training to be able to engage multiple foes and dispatch them. We see this in, kung fu movies. We see this in Star Wars. This is one of the few accounts where we actually see someone who talks about them falling back to their base level of training. So when the metal hits the road, when all of a sudden you're confronted with a situation, you fall back onto whatever the level of combat that you are used to training. You're the one that you are most familiar with, and he mentions it here. What happened to him? So let's see what it says. So it's the 22nd of May. Let's see if I can find what the year is. In 1555. Soon afterward, namely on the 22nd of May, I went to Kassel to visit my parents, who were both ill, with my housewife I mentioned before, and a boy who carried my Spanish coat and my spear. So this is going to come in relevant, which I carried while I carried the rapier, so I could draw it from the belt with my right hand. I encountered 5 drunk peasants up above the Tenhausen by the stone crosses, who took no pleasure in my correct report, for I knew how to keep myself according to the ordinances which had come from the prince. They suddenly wrestled me to the ground, and while falling, they grabbed my rapier, and I tried to stand up, still fully lying on the ground, and they struck a wound on my head. But after I had received the boar spear from my boy and wanted my rapier back, they kept retreating until the village of Dornheim. So they ran off with his sword, but from his aide, he got his big boar spear. Since I was fully winded and could no longer make use of my arms or the spear, which they had wholly intended, I leapt away from them over a ditch right in front of the village. Thereupon they let off and went into the village. So he chased after them, but he was too tired to confront them right then. Now, he says that he got away, but he didn't come away without an exchange between him and the peasants. So now we're going to talk about him engaging the peasants. Be warned, it gets pretty graphic, so sensitive viewers might want to pause here. This I resisted all the better with God, because I knew how to help myself with Versetzen and Abschlecken, according to the art of fencing. So now he's going to engage in his martial techniques. My dog also lived up to his name, since he is called Krieger, so war dog. He went from one to the other, bit them into the legs, which they were jerking backwards. Surely whoever was bitten by him did not strike. So he does have assistance. He's not at this alone. Krieger is with him. If the 5th one escaped with only dry strikes inflicted upon him, I do not know. Otherwise, I stabbed one's eye so it was hanging in front of his head. The other one I stabbed in the hand. I even split someone's arm behind the right hand, and the 4th one I stuck through the face, through his teeth. This is not someone who is playing around. He is being assaulted for his life, so he is making use of the spear. I also did not only have the mentioned wound on my head, but the pinky on my right hand was split. The next closest finger had the front of its nail cut off. The hand was crushed behind the middle finger, so it's probably his metacarpals that got shattered. Otherwise, along the right sleeve of the doublet, between the shoulder and the elbow, only the taffet was cut. A strike across the same shoulder hit my buff coat, and another one hit across my chest, both a span long, but without completion on my skin. Only on the chest and above an old injury, they split a silver button, causing this old wound to bleed. So it probably hit him real hard and forced the button into his skin, and an old wound seemed to have opened up. Likewise, on the left sleeve, below the elbow, and 3 stabs on the same arm into the elbow, deep into the skin, but not through the elbow. Instead, all of these rose bulgingly and became swollen. So it looks like most of the damage he suffered on his right hand, which makes sense. This is the hand that's going in. If he's using the spear, it's probably the one that's the leading hand, and he's perhaps using it in part to defend himself. And so that lead hand has his index and next finger very badly messed up, and his metacarpals are probably a disaster. And it sounds like his lower arm and upper arm both got heavily hit, and his chest is at least in part hit, and he has a whole bunch of stabs on his lower forearm as well, on his left hand. The peasants were well past atoning for this offense against the prince, also past reimbursing for my costs, so they would not get away so easily, for almost all of them have died. I'm not sure if that's alluding to the fact that he feels that the wounds he inflicted on them have killed him, or they have just died in subsequent fighting. But my arm constantly reminds me of this endured hardship and danger. This happened to me on the day stated above, Anno 55. And his concluding poem, True Friendship, Old Blows and Wounds, linked up in the same manner. Let them be noticed during all hours. So Liam points out that Hans is referencing the Germans' Peasant War, which happened almost 25 years earlier. So this wasn't an actual war. This was just him scuffling with peasants. But just like an American might reminisce about, oh, this was my Vietnam, this is his own version of the Peasants' War, which happened 25 years prior to this occurrence in 1555. So very interesting. So, it's very rare that you have a firsthand account of an actual fencer, or in this case, a Landsknecht, who engages in a fight with multiples. It sounds like he wasn't in the best condition. Again, he lost his sword in the course of the combat. He had a spear. He wanted his sword back, but in the end, he decided to retreat and not directly engage them, although he gave a pretty good account of it. The peasants ended up in a pretty poor condition. He doesn't say how they were armed, so we don't know exactly what weapons they had, but he certainly received some pretty serious wounds. It sounds like he carried with him for the remainder of his days. It's worth noting that he did continue to live to, I think, 80 years of age. So it's not as if he died immediately thereafter, but it sounds like he was banged up, and it impeded his ability to use his arms from this encounter going forward. So I hope that was interesting. I always like getting these firsthand accounts. We can always learn something from history. So make sure that you guys check out Liam's blog in the description below, and we'll be back on the channel for more sword content next time. Take care, guys.
Unsere Liebe